So welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship. It's Tuesday, July 6th. Hope you all had a long, wonderful weekend. At Leading with Empathy and Allyship, we have deep, real conversations about how we can be more inclusive leaders, how we can work to create change in our workplaces and communities, starting with ourselves, right? I'm Melinda Briana Epler, founder and CEO of Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. And this is a safe place to learn, to build empathy, and to understand tangible actions that we can all take to make a difference. This is a special season 4 where I talk about some of our most requested topics and answer questions from our live audience here. So today is episode 51. We'll be talking about recognizing and overcoming microaggressions. And this is part 1 of 2. So today we'll talk about what microaggressions are, why they're important to address them, and a bit about the impact they can have on people in the workplace and outside of the workplace, and then some common examples of verbal microaggressions in particular and alternatives. And then we'll keep going in the next episode with more around nonverbal microaggressions, environmental microaggressions, and some ways to start to interrupt them. So on screen are our ASL interpreters for today. And thank you again to Interpreter Now for our ongoing partnership. This is also being live captioned by Maggie at White Coat Captioning. So if you want to turn on captioning, it's not already on, just go down to the bottom of your screen and click close caption. And you should be able to change the settings and all that there as well. And then our team, Juliet, Renzo, Araya, Gigi, Emily, everybody is here doing amazing things behind the scenes to make this happen. And they're also in the chat and the Q&A. So if you have questions or technical issues, please do ask and engage in the chat. This has been really wonderful to engage with you over the last several episodes. So please share what you're learning, share what's resonating, share questions that you have. I'll also try to leave time for questions at the end too. If you have some specific questions, bigger questions, just put them in the Q&A function so that I can see them easily. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. So as you all know, I'm Melinda Briana Epler. I am the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst. And this slide is a picture of myself. I am a white woman with long red hair wearing in this photo. And actually today I'm also wearing a dark blue shirt with black and white glasses. You can find me on Twitter at mbriana epler or Instagram at Change Catalysts with an S, and also on LinkedIn. And essentially I create inclusive ecosystems using human systems design, storytelling, community building, and behavioral science. I've been doing this a long time, and I also have recently written a book. So I'm an author as well, a speaker, author, change maker, working to make the world more equitable, empathetic, and to really create change in our workplaces and our communities. So, as you all know, How to Be an Ally is a new book of mine coming out. I have spent hours, thousands and thousands of hours on it, kind of compiling all of what I have learned over the years. And I just made the final edits to it. I turned it in on Wednesday at around midnight. So it's now heading off to print. And I know some of you have all already purchased it, and I really appreciate you. So just a little ask, all of our content is free. And so if you can afford a little token of appreciation by buying the book, I would really appreciate it. And it makes a big difference in the overall success of the book. But either way, please share the link, and I appreciate you. Also, if you want to do any bulk book orders for your team, for your company, for your school, just reach out to us, and we will set you up with a discounted rate. Contact at changecatalyst.co. And thank you, Alex. I appreciate it. Yeah, it feels like an accomplishment. It's been a lot of work. All right, so For this special season 4 over the summer, we are diving into some of the subjects in the book. So to give you some important things that you can do right now to make a difference in your workplace and also in your communities. So the first episode, we talked about why empathy and allyship matter in the workplace, some of the business case for allyship, and how empathy and allyship influence diversity, equity, and inclusion, also what people want from allies. So if you missed that, please go back and listen to that. And then last episode, we talked about our biases and ensuring we're doing no harm through biases. We learned a lot of different types of biases and then how to self-regulate and continue to counter those biases through processes, systems, and workplace culture. So just a reminder that allyship is recognizing that there's an imbalance in opportunity in the world, in life, in how we go about our daily lives and our daily career and our careers. So that imbalance in opportunity, and then using your privilege and your power and your influence to change it. And change happens one person at a time, one act at a time, one word at a time. So it was really this constant learning process and growth process. We learn, we show empathy, and we take action. And then we use that power and influence that we have to create positive change for our colleagues, our friends, our family, our network, neighbors as well. So the steps that allies take are in my upcoming book. This is kind of how it's laid out in the book. Each is its own chapter. So you start by learning, unlearning, relearning. That's a lifelong process, right? We've learned a lot of things that have gaps, gaps in our history books, gaps in our networks, gaps in our understanding, and we need to fill those gaps and relearn. And then we don't get stuck in that. We take action. And so we work to do no harm. So we talked about understanding or correcting our biases, recognizing we have them, that they come from families, from friends, from media, from TV, from film, from our teachers. And then we learn to understand those biases and correct them. And then the second part of doing no harm is recognizing microaggressions and overcoming them. These are some of the most harmful things that we can do, and they're little, but they can really make a difference and create a lot of harm and trauma if we do them regularly. And so we'll talk about that over the next 2 episodes. So again, today we'll talk about what they are, especially focused on verbal microaggressions. And then next time we'll talk about nonverbal microaggressions, environmental microaggressions, and treating the impact of microaggressions, and also a little bit about microintervention, some of the things that you can do to kind of step in when you see something. So I'm going to talk a lot today, but please do use the chat. Please do let me know what's resonating, any experiences that you have along the way, any questions you have, and I'll take questions at the end as well. Okay, so microaggressions, we've defined this before. They're everyday slights, insults, negative verbal and nonverbal communications that, whether intentional or not, often unintentional, they can make somebody feel belittled, disrespected, unheard, unsafe, othered, tokenized, gaslighted, impeded, and just like somebody doesn't belong. And while smaller aggressions than bullying and harassment and macroaggressions, or abuse, of course, they can reinforce the inequities, and their effects can be traumatic and long-lasting. Sometimes they're called micro-exclusions. So microaggressions can be rooted in our biases and also our lack of understanding or empathy. So we did talk a lot about biases in the last episode. If you haven't had a chance to listen or watch that episode, I highly recommend going back and checking it out. Similar to biases, the key with microaggressions is to develop our empathy skills and to become more intentional so that we recognize microaggressions forming and we stop them before they come out. And just so you know, the term microaggressions was first described in 1970 by Chester Middlebrook Pierce. He was looking specifically at microaggressions against Black people at the time, and it's been evolving since to cover microaggressions against people of all underrepresented identities. So what happens in the moment of a microaggression physically is that you can have an amygdala hijack. It's a physical response in your brain that produces that fight, freeze, or flight response. And I don't know if I'm sure that many of you have experienced microaggressions at some point in your life, and you might think about like, how do you react in that moment? Are you fighting? Are you freezing? Are you looking to get out of there? I definitely freeze and kind of look for an out as well. So someone talks over me, somebody interrupts me repeatedly, somebody says something belittling or harassing, I generally shut down, I freeze. And then what does that do to innovation? What does that do to inspiration, right? How do you be your best self when somebody's telling you that you don't belong there, when they don't want to hear you, when they don't respect your experience or your identity? Over time, this can have some long-term effects. And then add to that the daily stress of racism, sexism, all the isms, all the discrimination many of us experience outside of work as well. And it really can accumulate into long-term health issues and trauma. Psychologist Daryl Wing Su, who has some great books out there, will link to those in the follow-up to this episode. He has built decades of work on microaggressions and racism and found that accumulated effects of microaggressions can be biological, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. Roberto Montenegro, who studies the biological effects of discrimination, also has shown that chronic exposure to microaggressions can turn into microtraumas, not only emotionally, but also physically. So both physically and emotionally. And then Christina Friedlander has shown the cumulative harm of microaggressions can include stress, anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, insomnia, substance abuse, eating disorders, social withdrawal, suicidal ideation, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Lots of studies are starting to come out about this. So while we call them micro, they add up over time. They can make a big difference in our lives, in our careers. So when we talk about doing no harm, right, the harm from microaggressions, they can be short-term, they can be long-term. And that's what it matters. It matters to us personally. It also matters to teams' effectiveness at work and to the company's bottom line, ultimately. These can change biases, microaggressions, discrimination, harassment, bullying, general othering, systemic inequalities. These can all change how you show up at work over time. And some of the things they can translate into: imposter syndrome. I'm sure some of you all have experienced this at one time or another in your lives. The imposter syndrome is feeling like I'm not the expert that I am, that I don't belong as a leader, despite being a leader, that I don't belong in the front of this room, despite having the experience to be able to do that and being invited even to do that. If you're told your whole life that you're not good enough, regularly experiencing microaggressions that question your expertise, you might begin to believe it, right? Stereotype threat, another one, fear that you might play into stereotypes of how people might perceive you. It's an extra weight that some people carry around with them. Covering a piece of your identity, code switching, so being somebody different, speaking a different language at work versus at home, holding yourself differently at home versus at work. Deloitte actually found that 83% of people who are LGBTQIA plus cover a piece of their identity. 79% of Black people do, 66% of women do, 63% of Latinx people do. So a lot of us are covering, we're doing extra work at work. That lack of productivity as well, lower engagement levels. There's a study that shows that a single incidence of a microaggression can lead to an immediate 25% decline in somebody's performance on a team project. And then leaving the company or the industry. So just as an example, we work a lot in the tech industry. 40% of women engineers ultimately leave tech. And they leave and they go on to be managers, and they grow up in other professions. Because who wants to stay where they're not respected and appreciated, right? So each individual microaggression can be harmful in the short term. and they can accumulate daily. They can take a significant toll over somebody's life and career in the long term. So people with underrepresented identities encounter microaggressions on top of the stress that everybody experiences, right? And that Catalyst, the company Catalyst calls that the emotional tax. It's something that is additive in our work. And as allies, it's our job to understand this, to understand the impact and what microaggressions are so that we don't do them, so that we don't create that harmful impact. Alex asks, can you briefly expand on what you mean by general othering? Yeah, it could be that, you know, tokenism, for example, is a kind of othering where you bring one person in from a diverse background and underrepresented background, and they can feel like they are representing all people from their identity. And they might be asked to represent all people from that identity is one kind of othering. Another is just kind of making somebody feel that they don't belong in any kind of a way. So there's that in-group, out-group bias we talked about last time. So if you have an in-group around you and an out-group over there, somebody else that's over there, right? They're experiencing othering in that way. Does that help, Alex? Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. Okay, so there are different types of microaggressions, and generally verbal, nonverbal, and environmental. And so we'll focus on the verbal microaggressions today, and next time we'll get to the other two. All right. So interrupting. Yeah, and to interrupt myself here, Tanya says favoritism is another example. Absolutely, is a form of othering as well. Okay, interrupting and taking more than your share of airtime. So interrupting somebody while they're speaking, talking over somebody's words, not allowing somebody to finish their thought. People with underrepresented identities are more likely to be interrupted. Men are 3 times more likely to interrupt women than another man. And of course, interruptions can be verbal and nonverbal. So if we're thinking about what we're going to say next, we might be saying something with our body language that tells somebody that we're not actually listening to them. And that's a form of interrupting as well. That's interrupting their thought process if they were paying attention to that. So make sure you take a step back and listen with empathy. Try not to form your ideas before somebody has finished sharing theirs, and respectfully allow them to finish their complete thought. And then make the space. So taking up more than your share of our time as well as another piece, dominating the conversation, not creating space for somebody to speak. Speaking on panels or at events that don't have diverse speakers can be another example of this. A study from Brigham Young and Princeton universities found that in a mixed population at the table, men take up 75% of the conversation in a meeting. So be aware of who is taking up airtime. Be aware of the airtime you're taking. Create openings in the conversation for people. Sometimes that means giving breath in that conversation. Sometimes it means giving a little bit of silence, which can be uncomfortable if you're not used to it. But take a little bit of that uncomfortable silence to allow somebody to step in. And then, of course, say no to panels without diverse speakers, and suggest somebody with an underrepresented identity in your place if you're from a majority population, if you're from a majority identity. And in general, you know, always a good practice if you can, if you're asked to speak, to continue to open the space up for others, for people with other identities. Okay, so then negating somebody's identity or language is a big one. It shows up in a lot of different ways. At the basic level, not doing the work to know somebody's name. So for example, calling somebody a common name from their culture. I can't remember their name. It's like Raj or something. Or not learning how to pronounce somebody's name. That woman with a name I just can never pronounce. Or just continuously mispronouncing somebody's name, or mixing up the names of two different people who are Black at your company, or two different people who are Latinx or Asian or Arab and or women. This actually happens a lot. Somebody's name is a key piece of their identity. It doesn't take much effort to learn them. Even on LinkedIn now, a lot of people put pronunciations. You can put pronunciations. You can put pronouns there as well. Now, FYI, in case you haven't done that yet. So learn their name. You can practice it. I write them down phonetically as well for myself, just so that I know in the future. And it's okay to ask. It's definitely okay to ask how does somebody pronounces their name. And when you do, just write it down for yourself so you remember it. Mixing up people's names can be a form of invisibilization, which we talked about last time, biases and kind of making people feel invisible. Another one is negating somebody's identity. This can happen when you say, I don't see race, I'm colorblind, or we're all one race, the human race. It can also happen asking somebody of a mixed race, what are you? Which is super dehumanizing. No, first of all, nobody should be referred to as what versus who, right? And yeah, Pia says that bothers you, yeah. Telling somebody of a mixed race what race they are. Looking at somebody visibly and saying, you know, you're white, you look white, you're totally white. Or you don't look or act like a normal Black person, Asian person, disabled person, etc. What is that telling somebody? Tone down your appearance. Don't tone down your appearance, or don't bring your lifestyle to work is another piece of negating identity. Incorrectly identifying somebody's race or ethnicity or disability. Kevin, yeah, thank you. Hey, everybody, I just realized I didn't see that when you chat, if you could just chat to all panelists and attendees, that would be awesome. Thank you, Kevin, for pointing that out. I didn't notice. Another way of negating somebody's identity is providing the wrong type of accessibility for somebody's disability. So giving I read an article, or I read a social media, I think it was a tweet recently, where somebody who was deaf was on a plane, and the flight attendant gave them the instructions, the safety instructions in Braille. They were deaf, and the flight attendant gave them a Braille document, right, for somebody who is blind. Often well-intentioned, these things can be really, really harmful. I don't see race, or I'm colorblind, can be experienced as I'm erasing or ignoring a piece of your identity. I am ignoring the fact that by not seeing race or color, it's a privilege, right? That many people don't have, because society treats people differently based on visible identity. So instead, learn and acknowledge somebody's unique identity, culture, tradition, history, experience, as well as the unique oppression and systemic barriers they may face as a result. And then remember to value difference. We've talked about that several times, that not centering your own identity and culture as the norm, but recognizing that each identity and culture is equally normal, equally valuable, and do the work to really understand different identities. So some other things here: disparaging somebody's language, which can come out by calling an indigenous language a foreign language, by saying you don't sound Black, or asking somebody from a racial or ethnic minority group, why do you sound white? Which for those of you who have read Michelle Obama's book, she writes about that. As a child, she was asked that question repeatedly in her neighborhood in Chicago. These can be a form of cultural gaslighting. We talked about gaslighting in the last episode. They can also be a form of erasure, cultural erasure, making somebody feel like their internal identity is incongruent with what should be, what the norm is. So avoid these phrases and sentiments and work to ensure somebody feels they belong, that their language and their identity belongs. And then lastly, assuming somebody is foreign because they present as being from a minority or as being from somebody from a minority ethnic or racial group. So phrases like, you speak good English. They might be from an English-speaking country. But even so, is that really a compliment? But where are you really from? Is a common microaggressions. These are othering statements, and they can feel somebody is like an alien in their own land, like they don't belong. So instead, just, if you're interested in where their hometown is, ask, where did you grow up? If people want to tell you about their race and ethnicity, they will. And if not, it's okay, right? Yeah, I think we talked about this. So I'm going to move on to referring to an artificial gender binary, or referring or grouping everybody using terms referring to men is another piece of that. So using terms like 50-50 gender balance, instead use gender parity. Ladies and gentlemen, try everyone, right? Boys and girls, again, everyone, you all, y'all. Channel your inner Texan if you're from the US. These are binary terms that exclude people who are non-binary and gender non-conforming. There are lots of different non-binary is a spectrum. Here's some of the many terms that people identify with, identities that people identify with, and then the other piece is making sure you don't center on men as being the norm with you guys, mankind, that kind of language as well. And sometimes, it's so normalized that I hear a lot of women saying, well, it doesn't bother me, I use it too. But what are you really saying when you do? Do we really want to be using language that's centering men as the norm, right? Or is it time to change that? So misgendering, dead naming or outing somebody. So misgendering, assuming somebody's gender identity based on your perception of how they look. Or dismissing their pronouns. This can be especially harmful for people who are transgender, non-binary, and or gender non-conforming. So don't assume somebody's pronouns, look them up. A lot of people will share them on social media. Or just ask people when you first meet them, I use she, her pronouns. What are your pronouns? Something simple like that. Awesome, Alex and John. I appreciate you letting me know that last slide was impactful. Yeah. Dead naming. So using the name of somebody, using the name that somebody was assigned at birth before they changed their name. In a similar vein, saying somebody used to be a man, a woman, he, she. That language can be really harmful. Transitioning is an external presentation of an internal identity. So a person may never have identified with that sex assigned at birth. So if somebody has transitioned, just do the work to relearn their gender, their name. Make sure that you do that tiny little bit of work to make somebody feel like they belong. And then the last piece here, outing somebody. So asking somebody who's transgender and or has a disability to identify themselves publicly. Or talking about somebody's disability, gender, transition, religion publicly without their permission, it could be potentially outing them as well. So when somebody comes out as transgender or having a disability, it can be a difficult process to navigate, and they may do it in phases. Anybody along the LGBTQIA+ community, in the LGBTQIA+ community might experience this, and give them that space allow them to do it on their own terms. Coming out in a private conversation is really different than coming out publicly. So remember that. People from different religions also, some have been severely persecuted, and so they may cover pieces of their religion because out of safety. And so they may not want that public. People with disabilities as well. It may take time to fully come into their identity. So let people tell their own story, however and to whomever they would like to tell it. Yeah, John says outing somebody must have their consent. Yeah, absolutely. Diminishing somebody's accomplishments. So this could be questioning somebody's expertise, that prove it again bias, consistently questioning somebody's expertise, asking to see somebody's badge at your company if they don't look like they fit in. This happens a lot in the tech industry. Treating a person of color as the hotel or event staff at a conference rather than the attendee or a speaker. Or at a restaurant, treating them as a valet rather than a customer. This happens a lot. It happens regularly to my husband, who is Black, and to my friends who are Black. And so really check your biases in those moments. Assuming somebody is a veteran, that somebody who is a veteran has no skills other than to be aggressive or to use a gun. I heard a really awful microaggression once. She worked in the military, so she has a fighting instinct, but what else can she do really? And it turns out, of course, she led a large team under high stress situations to debug military grade technology, right? So check, those are first impression identity biases usually. People from underrepresented identities generally have to prove their expertise and their skills over and over and over again throughout their lives, even when they've achieved leadership positions. I don't know if y'all saw, I believe it was last year, Edward Enninful, the British Vogue editor-in-chief and the first Black editor of the magazine, was walking into his office and was told to use the garage entrance as he entered his own office. So just pause, catch yourself, and interrupt those biases before you do or say something that can cause harm. Dismissing somebody's experience with systemic inequity and marginalization. This is kind of a form of gaslighting, right? Everyone can succeed if they work hard enough, or insisting on a meritocracy, or saying, don't play the race card. I'm not a racist is another one. If you're defending yourself when somebody points out a microaggression, I'm not a racist. It's a form of gaslighting, and a large body of research shows that people with underrepresented identities are discriminated against and marginalized. We know that. So just remember to listen to people's experiences and believe them. And also a combination of the last one and this one, implying somebody was hired because they had an unfair advantage as somebody who has an underrepresented identity. So calling somebody a diversity hire, or otherwise implying that they were hired because of their identity versus their expertise. Insisting on reverse discrimination. So this is the combination again of the last one, diminishing somebody's expertise and also dismissing the system of oppression that they've experienced. It can be very belittling. Our hiring process have actually embedded biases in them for a long time that have excluded people with underrepresented identities for years. So finally, companies are starting to correct this inequity and bring in qualified candidates from diverse backgrounds that they had been putting barriers against, right? So in the same way, you probably wouldn't say he's a white male hire, right? You wouldn't want to say he's a diversity hire. That person is a diversity hire. Catch yourself if you're thinking this and recognize and support somebody's unique experience and skills and expertise. And if you see it, also interrupt that as well. We'll talk about interrupting more next time. Explaining for somebody. So what she's trying to say is, blank, or explaining a concept to somebody who is an expert in the field. Often this is based on stereotypes and identity bias, right? Assuming somebody's not intelligent or experienced. Some people call this mansplaining or whitesplaining. It's assuming somebody doesn't know and isn't an expert in this. Instead, assume somebody is experienced and intelligent. Allow somebody to explain their ideas themselves rather than trying to explain them for them. And only explain a concept to somebody if they want to know more, right? You might be talking to an expert in the field. So just be aware of that. Another is taking credit for somebody else's idea. This happened a lot when I was an executive, and often happens when often a person with an underrepresented identity will share an idea that's dismissed by the group and then later is repeated by somebody else and is championed. So it can negatively affect somebody's career. So make sure that you listen to people's ideas, give them credit. If you see this is happening, just say something simple like, Liz's idea that you just brought up was great. Maybe she has more to say about that, or, somehow attribute it back to them, bring it back. So, and also giving the person the wrong person credit for an idea, kind of another piece of this, another example of this. Yeah, Pia says, I've been called a token to my face. I hope, Pia, is it okay if I share this? I realize you just sent it to panelists. I'll wait until you respond to that. Okay, yeah. So Pia says, I've been called a token to my face so many times. My reaction always surprising the audience. How does it feel that I am a token getting the job done that you could not? This certainly does not foster camaraderie, but it does stop the hazing. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, to just call it out with actions as well as words too, I think is yeah. Okay, moving on to objectification, exoticization, and inspiration porn. So Stella Young, this is Stella Young. She has a great TEDx talk called I Am Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much, where she talks about inspiration porn. So inspiration porn is treating people with disabilities as an inspiration. The way you overcome your disability is so inspiring. So what is that? What is that saying to somebody? Instead of seeing disability as a weakness or something to overcome, recognize disability as somebody's proud and powerful identity. I highly encourage you to watch. It's short, it's great. Also, rags to riches stories of poor people and immigrants overcoming obstacles against all odds. This is perpetuated in the media a lot. Exoticizing people or cultures, treating people as objects rather than humans in some way. Tokenism, again, kind of bringing that back, using one or a handful of people to create the impression of diversity, or asking them to represent all people from their culture or identity. These can be dehumanizing. They can reinforce stereotypes. They can objectify a person for the benefit of others. It shows up so much in film and television, video games, talk shows, books, toys, media, workplaces. The fashion and advertising industries have notoriously exoticized and treated models as objects, and they're starting to come to terms with that now. Instead of using people's stories and looks and identities for your own benefit, for the benefit of your own inspiration, make a difference by humanizing and fixing the systemic barriers for them, for people with underrepresented identities. Flip that. How can you help? How can you be an ally? So we have a lot of racist, prejudiced, ableist sayings that have kind of stuck in our culture, in our languages. There are many phrases that we use that have deeply racist backstories, or they're considered cultural appropriation. Catch yourself before you say them and find alternatives. So Just some of them here: Vision Quest, Indian Giver, Soul Down the River, No Can Do, Long Time No See, That's So Gay, Powwow, Spirit Animal, Open the Kimono. These are all, and master slave terminology is a big one that Tokenism needs to do a lot of work on. Racist sayings are pretty prevalent. These are pretty prevalent. So find alternatives for yourself and just change that. Don't use those. I'm not going to go through each of these and explain them. Alex, I see you've asked that question, but I encourage you to Google it because they're all pretty Googleable. Yeah, awesome. Many common phrases are also derogatory and rooted in ableist ideas. So the right side of the slide that I'm showing is a bunch of terminology that is kind of ableist and shows disability in a negative or less than, abnormal or deviant light, right? Blind to, blinded by, turn a blind eye, deaf to, falling on deaf ears, crazy, insane, loony, lame, moronic, feeble-minded, mental. These are terms that I grew up learning, and they were normalized when I grew up, and they're not okay. Educate yourself about these terms, and just find other terms. There's so many great terms instead. You can say wild instead of crazy. I mean, you can instead of yeah. I'm seeing lots of comments. Oh, a little aha moments in the chat. Just think about alternatives. Spend a little bit of time today, maybe over the next few days, and catch yourself and just find alternatives to some of the words that you might be using. And then also, of course, ableism goes far beyond language, right? So also just educate yourself beyond language as well. There's a lot of normalizations here that we have that are not okay. And then the last one is centering your experience as the norm, centering your identity, your culture, your communication style, and everyone else is kind of abnormal or inferior in some way. There's a lot of little ways that we do this. I'm just going to talk about a few specifically when it comes to people with disabilities. So we center disability language often we'll center disability language around ableist ideas of disability by using phrases like differently abled or handicapped, handy-capable, the disabled, special needs, specially abled. This is language that often centers the norm around people with disabilities to make them feel more comfortable, while othering people with disabilities and showing them as abnormal, as inspirational, as less than. So generally, just in terms of disability language, people generally prefer people with disabilities, which is person-first language, or disabled people. And there's, you kind of have to ask somebody if you can. Disabled people is identity first language, or what people call the social model of disability, the idea that people aren't disabled in their bodies, they're disabled by society. Or people, there are lots of people that would like to be identified specifically by their disability, like autistic, deaf, blind, deafblind. And so do ask when you have the opportunity. Another part of this is when people say somebody suffers from a particular disability, or they're wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. Again, nobody's bound or confined to a wheelchair. So use instead better terms, wheelchair user, or somebody who uses a wheelchair. So just little words that can make a big difference in how you're showing your perception of them and how they feel about that. So we talked, I gave a lot of kind of alternatives along the way. In addition, because these are based in biases, you can use similar processes to interrupt microaggressions that you can interrupting biases. So, find opportunities to learn, to unlearn, to relearn, keep learning, keep growing, listen to people, follow new people on social media. I've learned a ton on social media. Read books from different points of view, different perspectives, from diverse authors, go to events that you wouldn't normally go to, find ways to learn, and then pause. This can be a hard one, but it just takes a little more time sometimes to say things in a way that's not going to create harm. That might mean that, even when you're composing a tweet, sometimes it'll take me several minutes to compose a tweet, because I just want to make sure that I'm not inadvertently causing harm, right? So pause, humanize, empathize before you say or do things. Give yourself time to disrupt your response just in case you have a bias there. Self-regulate as a part of this as well. Stop and hear your words from multiple perspectives before you say them. And then normalize the acknowledgement and countering of microaggressions in the same way that you are doing that with biases. Call each other out on your team. Make it normal to just educate each other around it and open up to that education. And then, of course, create a culture that values DEI, because that is going to be easier to create that normalization of countering biases and microaggressions. Develop processes that reduce microaggressions. So, for example, how can you develop a meeting process that gives equal distribution of airtime, that reduces interruptions, that allows everybody to speak? Those can be easy little things that you can enter into your meetings. How can you reduce microaggressions in performance reviews? In performance reviews, microaggressions can come out in lots of different ways in the feedback that we give. And so how can you, with training, with processes, kind of counter that and provide useful feedback, give people different examples of what is useful feedback, what is good feedback, and start to counter that with processes as well. And then the last is, if you're in a position to offer formal and informal learning opportunities in your team, at your company as well. So help people learn about and explore allyship, empathy, inclusive leadership, microaggressions, biases, through training, through informal learning and other educational resources. Lots of different ways you can do that. Lots of different training modules out there now. Lots of different companies like ours that are doing training. So lots of different ways that you can rethink the culture, rebuild the culture in a way that is more inclusive and reduces biases and microaggressions as well. And this isn't meant to be a be-all checklist of what not to do, of course. It's just some daily microaggression, what some daily microaggressions might look like, and how you can reframe your approach and work toward eliminating microaggressions in your own work. You might see things here that you have done. At one time or another, all good allies find ourselves making mistakes, and it's our job as allies to listen, to learn, to unlearn, and also to make mistakes, apologize, and keep learning, right? So there are lots of people whose lives we can change if we improve how we show up for them in the present and in the future. And so if you have done something that created harm in the past, forgive yourself for it. Forgive yourself. And if you've done it recently, you might go back to that person or group and apologize. And then keep working hard to do it, not do it in the future, and continuously learn and grow. So as I said, we are, this is part 1 of 2 on verbal microaggressions. We'll talk about nonverbal microaggressions, which includes avoidance, and some environmental microaggressions as well. And then we'll also talk a little bit about micro interventions too, some of the things that you can do to intervene. We won't get to everything, but we will get to some things there too, so you have more. Awesome. So if you have questions, we do have a little time here for questions. I do see one, and please put any other questions that you have in the Q&A. So an anonymous attendee asks, can we say out of your mind instead of crazy, or is that a turn of phrase ableist too? What are some alternatives? Yeah, I wouldn't, because it still implies that some kind of ableism there. I think I would say wild. I would say anybody else have alternatives to using insane, crazy, mad, those kinds of words? Please put them in the chat. Is impaired a better word than disabled? No, because impaired still implies that there is something less than, that it's not a whole person. Or yeah, so generally impaired, I would not use impaired. Disabled is a better word than impaired. Yeah, we're getting some other thoughts to our anonymous person around bizarre. So yeah, doesn't make sense. Yeah. Are you thinking clearly? Yeah. Awesome. John asks, how do you influence change in a fake equity environment without having direct authority? That's a big question. Yeah, and not totally related to microaggressions. So I will say that it is and it isn't. There are lots of things that you can do to either on your team, because generally you're probably working with other people, so you can start to help create some team norms, and you can do things with other people. So you don't have to be an ally on your own. You can also have group allyship where you're working together to create change. So that might be around changing norms around meetings, or I think I mentioned in the last episode that women in the Obama administration were finding that they were talked over and interrupted a lot. So they kind of grouped together, and together they started amplifying each other. So when a woman said something, another woman would echo them and amplify their words. And it really made a difference in the team culture. So there are ways that you can do it at a team level. And then I would say also, give feedback to your CEO, your manager, your supervisor. Let them know you care about this and you're seeing things that aren't okay. And I will say that a lot of companies reach out to us for training, for work that we do, because people have said something, and they keep hearing over and over again that they need microaggressions training, or they need allyship training, or there's something happening in the culture that they keep getting feedback about. So give that feedback. And then the third thing I would say is that if your CEO, your supervisor has made some kind of commitment around diversity, equity, and inclusion, hold them to it and check in with them. How are you doing that? Is there any way that I can help? And then really quickly, Kimberly asks, do you have thoughts about how we hold companies accountable within organizations where this work isn't being done, or we've experienced egregious experiences? Some of what I already said, I think telling them that that it's not okay with you is a big thing. And doing that in groups is better, is easier. So if you can do that. There was we did an episode with Tito earlier this last season. And we'll link to that in the resources after this, that where Tito talks about, there were a lot of people who are Asian from the AAPI community that wanted to change wanted the company to acknowledge microaggressions and systemic racism and violence that their communities were experiencing and still are experiencing. And so she talks about what they did to go about that. So I would highly recommend looking at that as well. Awesome. All right. Thank you all for your questions and for your chats. I really appreciate this. Just a really quick, how to be an ally is available for pre-order, as I already said. And then a special season 4, we are down to July 20th is our last episode of the season, where we'll be talking more about microaggressions. And so there were a couple of questions that I didn't get to in the chat. So if you had questions that I didn't get to, please bring them to the next session and I will commit to doing that. And with that, thank you all. I just want to ask you all to make sure that you commit to doing something different after this discussion today. What different thing will you do? What will you work on? How will you create change? And we'll see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, there are 50 other episodes. So if you haven't listened to or watched them all, check them out. Ally.cc, http://ally.cc. And we have lots of amazing guests who shared their wisdom over the last year. And then lastly, I need allies too. So as an ally, you can do a few things. Buy the book, tell people about the book, and give us a 5-star rating on the podcast, review it and subscribe to it as well. All of those things can make a difference for us. Thank you for all the work you do. You all have a wonderful week. Bye.